Hello, and welcome back to Plants Part 2. So, last time we spoke about basically an overview of what makes the plant kingdom, and then we talked about an overview of the two major groups inside the plant kingdom, which is the non-vascular plants, which are mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, and the vascular plants, which is split into three further groups, which is the seedless, and then the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, which are both seeded. So now we're going to get into the vascular plants. And before that, we need to talk about what makes a vascular plant vascular. As we said earlier, we went from green algae to the non-vascular, and all the, mosses, very tiny because they're working on osmosis and diffusion. And unless something, changes with our gravity, and I hope it never does, osmosis and diffusion can only go so far. After a while, it can't overcome gravity. So, which is why moss, hornworts, and liverworts have stayed very small, soft, and fuzzy, which is great for them. They don't mind. They're happy with that. But some plants decided, you know what, we want to get huge. And that's where vascularization came in, and they figured out something really important, which was the use of straws. And I want to kind of bring this up in the fact that they didn't know they were doing this at the time, but they, again, used physics to their advantage to get what they wanted. And we do it too every time we use a straw. Who's ever played with their drink and their straw when they're bored at a restaurant or something, and you put your finger on top and you lift up your straw and there's a whole bunch of liquid stuck in the straw because of, remember, most of our drinks are based on water, therefore they have cohesion, and they love it. Water loves itself in the fact that it loves to hang on to each other, which is why don't jump out of an airplane and aim for water. Water doesn't like it when things come at it fast. But that's another tale for another time. But long story short, if you've ever played with a straw and you've ever played with a liquid before, and I believe we all have, this is basically what plants figured out, which is their main vascular tissues over here that we're going to be talking about quite a bit is xylem and phloem. Now, xylem is like the straws that we play with, when you're bored at a restaurant or whatever. And, or even when you're playing with a pipette or stuff like that. Basically, xylem is hard-walled, and it's usually for going just one direction, which is up. And how this is achieved, if you remember, we talked about the stomata, which are the pores on the surface of leaves and whatnot on plants and on other parts. Basically, what happens is a suction force starts occurring. So basically, when the plant has their stomata open, the guard cells open up the stomata, the plant will lose liquids. And this is normal, along with the plant, again, trying to suck in carbon dioxide and kick out oxygen through the stomata. Another thing that happens is that water is lost. Again, what happens is water evaporates out of the stomata, which creates a pressure gradient in the fact that basically water is being shifted between its liquid form into its gaseous form, which starts pulling away, which starts a force of being pulled up, kind of like when we drink out of a straw. And that's what the xylem does. All the liquid is going in one direction up because the stomata are open. And as long as this works, it basically makes a straw effect, suction effect. And that's basically one of the parts of the vascular tissue of vascular plants is basically making itself into a giant straw with this elevator. Now, if you've ever played Minecraft, I know I'm jumping around on my things here. There's a thing called the water elevator, if you've ever played with that. My son's really good at building it these days. I remember when I played Minecraft in beta, and now it's insane. Like, I tried to jump back in and play the other day with my son, and gosh, there's so many updates that I was like, oh! So anyway, the Phloem is kind of like the water elevator trick, if you've ever built it. Basically, it's 2 columns of water in Minecraft, and depending on what you put down at the bottom, I think is like magma on one and soul sand on the other one. It makes this water elevator where one column makes you go up and the other column makes you go down. And you can use it as an elevator up and down giant builds or whatnot. Or drown in it like I do because I'm a dingus. Anyway, but phloem's kind of like that. It goes both ways. So phloem's soft-walled. Remember, xylem is hard-walled, kind of like a xylophone. You know, if you've ever played with a xylophone, they have hard, either wooden or metal planks that you bonk. So the xylem is hard, phloem flows. So they are soft walls, but they have these perforated in between the cells, and that allows a kind of a double flow going here, where we've got flow going down and up at the same time. And the perforation helps with this. But again, one of the main driving points of both xylem and phloem is the fact that when stomata are open on the leaves, this creates that suction, that force. So therefore, we get, flow upwards against gravity. And once vascular plants had that down, they went, we can get as tall as we want now, because now we have, basically, water evaporating out of our stomata that makes water go up against gravity, and bada bing, bada boom, we're good. Now we can be huge, and they went there. So, not so much ferns, but everybody else definitely. Now, that doesn't mean that's the only thing going on. So remember, we got the epidermis and the stomata basically running the vascular tissue. And usually if you cut a vascular plant, you'll find the xylem and the phloem, usually in the middle. And in between the xylem and the phloem is ground tissue, and then the dermal tissue, or the epidermis, where you find all the stomata and everything. And basically the ground tissue is split up into 3 groups, which are the most fun words to say, I think, in the plant kingdom. And that is parenchyma, calynchyma, and sclerenchyma. Sclerenchyma. I just like saying that, sclerenchyma. So anyway, and these are different ground tissues. So again, xylem and phloem has this work. Basically, a xylem is up, so it's bringing water and minerals from the roots, because again, the stomata open, water evaporates. This creates basically a suction, and we get up against gravity because we're working with tiny straws, and it's capillary action plus, a gradient of the water evaporating, getting yoinked out of the plant, and that creates a flow. So we've got a couple of things going here, because xylem aren't as big as our straws, at least not in some of the smaller plants. But anyway, and you can look at this under a, thing right here. Definitely you can see the xylem and the phloem. And again, the phloem has 2-way flow. Xylem is 1-way. That's it. It's just water and minerals. There's no end between the cell walls. If stiffened with ligand, again, we need that stiffness to help us with the capillary action as well as the evaporation once it gets to the stomata and bringing that draw up the straw, kind of like when we suck on a straw. So phloem is a 2-way because of these end walls with the perforations, and it's water and food, so that way all the food that's being made up near the sun and the photosynthetic products can get back down and get stored in the roots and or shared with the our buddies, the fungi that live down there, that have been harvesting all the minerals for them to shoot up their xylem. So that's xylem and phloem in a nutshell. Again, these two are extremely important because this is the vascular tissue that pretty much runs on plants. Now, that's why they don't need a heart like we do in the animal kingdom, and we'll get to hearts later. But again, if you look at this, remember phloem transports sugars, and in angiosperms, it has a siege tube to contain sugar solution. So again, running a bit like that. We got the spongy mesophyll. This is the chlorhynchoma, and usually the chlorhynchoma is usually where all the chloroplasts are hanging out. The parenchyma is also another place. All the chloroplasts are called parenchyma cells. These are usually close to where, it's outside, so that way it's getting all the sunlight. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for, chloroplasts to be inside the plant where they can't hit the sun. So anything on the outside, facing the outside, is usually filled or has the parenchyma. Now, the parenchyma basically are living cells. They function as support, but the sclerenchyma is usually dead cells. And the only thing that's left behind on these guys are the cell walls. And again, they provide support. So remember, sclerenchyma and parenchyma basically are all the support the plant needs to get huge. And sometimes we really like, for instance, a good example of sclerenchyma is cork. Literally, you can go up to a cork tree and pull the sclerenchyma off, and that's literally the cork. It's just dead cells. The only thing that's left behind is their cell walls, and it gives support and protection to the plant. So that way, again, what is wood? It's usually parenchyma. And if you've ever kind of, cut into like a branch or something with a pocket knife, you've hit the green part, which is the parenchyma. It's still alive, but it has a lot of cell wall to it. So therefore, it's the green part. The outer part that's brown and dead and acting like protection is the parenchyma. So again, plants don't need a skeleton because they've got these guys right here that are basically made up of nothing but cell wall. And this is also how we get rings in plants, especially in trees, to show their age. So depending on, which layer's alive and which layer's dead, you can actually get a new layer every year, and therefore we can count the rings and figure out how old a tree is. Fun! So that's pretty much in a nutshell all of these tissues that you need to know. So this brings us to the seedless vascular plants. So we're going into the ferns. So these guys are kind of interesting because a lot of the stuff that we see, or at least the haploid part, the gametophyte part, we don't see it much, especially if you're walking through a forest. Now remember, in the non-vascular plants like the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts, their dominant life form on their alternation of generations is the gametophyte stage. So when you sit there and touch moss, you are touching the gametophyte stage. Okay, you're touching male and female little gametophytes, and that's what the predominant stage of moss is. So when you sit there and touch moss, you can go, I am touching the gametophytes. Make it weird, make it awkward. That's what I do. That's why everybody probably doesn't go hiking with me much. Anyway, now, from here on out in the vascular plants, everything you've seen, whether it be the seedless, the gymnosperms, or the angiosperms, what you're looking at when you're looking at a pine tree is the mature sporophyte. So remember, non-vascular gametophyte is dominant. Tough question. Vascular sporophyte is dominant. And in this case is no different. And when you look at a fern, you're looking at a mature sporophyte. So these guys have a dominant sporophyte generation. So that's what you see. It's rare for you to find the gametophyte because these guys are tiny and you need a microscope. So a mature sporophyte fern has those familiar leafy fronds, and they actually do not have true roots again, so we're still not to the true roots. So if you remember, we go back. Nope. Yeah, there we go. They have rhizomes. So if you go over here, these are the rhizomes. Now it's fun because the rhizome technically is the stem. So what we would think of the stem on, for instance, an angiosperm, which is flowering plants, they are, you have your stem and you have the leaves coming out the sides, right? Well, in this case, they didn't quite get that all together. What we're looking at when we look at, for instance, a fern, is you are looking at the root underground in which you've ever pulled up one fern, you've probably accidentally pulled up the whole freaking stem, which was known as the rhizome. And the part that you're looking at is technically the leaf, but we call that the frond on a fern. So, because it's not exactly a leaf, not there yet. Because again, ferns then led to gymnosperms, and angiosperms split off somewhere too. So, again, we call these blades. This is in the middle of the rachis, and you got the pinna and the pinnule, which is those little tiny itty bitty little guys coming off. Because some ferns have, even tinier little fern leaves coming off. So anyway, and the part coming up from underground is called the stripe, but the actual stem, what we'd consider a stem, is actually called the rhizome. So their stems are underground. So we're just looking at the leaf sticking up underground when you're looking at a fern. And when it comes up as a baby, it's called a fiddlehead because it's rounded out, or it's called a crow's ear. I know them as fiddleheads, and actually you can eat fiddleheads. It's actually when ferns are actually pretty yummy in the spring. You can cut down a lot of fiddleheads and actually saute them up and eat them. They just taste like sauteed fern. I'm trying to think of, I don't know. It tastes like a leafy green. Anyway, and then there's teeny weeny little roots that comes off the rhizome. So keep in mind, ferns are a little bit buried underground. Now, what happens, again, this is why these guys have to be in near water, because we still need some water for this. They don't need it as much as the, remember, water was pretty much, moss, are completely dependent on being near water to get their fertilization done. These guys need it too, but they can just do with groundwater under in the dirt. So they're fine with that. So basically what we see is a mature sporophyte. Now, if we start there, in the fall, if you've ever done this and you flipped over a fern and you see all those little brown dots all over the back, those are called sori, and they're clusters of sporangia. So we've got spores. So this is why they're seedless. We don't have seeds yet. That's next group. So what they do is when those spores form, they release their spores. Then it hits wet ground, hopefully, and the spores will germinate. And they will germinate into these interesting guys called sporangia, which are the gametophytes. So this is the gametophyte. They are heart-shaped. They are really interesting. In the middle, and I should have gotten a picture of this from some slides I did, but in the middle is where you will find the eggs. So the eggs will be in the middle of this heart-shaped gametophyte, and around the ends is where all the sperm is being held. So eventually, the egg and the sperm actually can, again, the sperm can leave, or the egg can, the sperm can find these eggs or whatnot, or they find somebody else, another gametophyte that's hanging out next door, and again, the sperm and the egg meet and fertilize, and off this gametophyte that's underground, a new sporophyte will start to grow out and turn into a fiddlehead, and then eventually grow into a really, really, really long rhizoid, and all the fronds sticking out from there. So a fern isn't just one frond, it's actually a whole bunch of them together is one whole plant. So, and like I said, if you've ever accidentally ripped one up and then you've hit the rhizoid and went, ooh, and ripped the whole stem out from underground. So, that is how the ferns do it. The ferns, the horsetails, the whisks, and the fourth dude. Oh, now I have to go back because I need to know. Ferns, club mosses. Club mosses, horsetails, and whisk ferns. Ha 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 ha. So, that's a fern in a nutshell. And what makes them different from everybody else? So again, these guys don't have seeds. We aren't to seeds yet. So again, these guys do need water. They need it to be at least damp, especially in the dirt, because this is where all this stuff happens. This is in the dirt. When the spores fall down, they hit the dirt, then they turn into the gametophyte, which is this heart-shaped dude. Isn't that nice? They have cute little heart shapes. And eventually fertilize, turn into an embryo, and off the gametophyte, a young sporophyte pops up, turns into the fiddlehead, and then eventually grows into the sporophyte, which is what we know as ferns. Bada bing. So, no seeds. Not yet. Still need dampness. And again, you're going to see this same dependence on water happening in the animal kingdom too, but in a different way. We came up with some different thoughts on that. So, again, now we go to the next group of the vascular plants, which is the most successful of the groups, which is the gymnosperms. These are vascular plants that finally we have discovered how to produce seeds. And the reason we figured that out is because we needed to go to drier and drier places. We needed to be able to protect those spores in a coating so they don't dry out between falling off the parent and then landing and sprouting somewhere else. And another thing is the gymnosperms are masters of the wind, whether we like it or not. These guys have figured out how to use the wind not only to shove their seeds far, far away from themselves, but also to pollinate each other, which drives us all bonkers in the spring if you're allergic to pollen. And everybody's just, not happy in the spring because the gymnosperms open up and just dump all of their pollen everywhere for the wind to blow onto a pine tree down the road. So they do it with the wind. And because of this, though, it's worked for them so well that they're the most successful group. So I guess don't knock wind because they love it as much as we hate it in the spring and when we're covered in pollen. Anyway, so now there are two types of, pine cones. This is where the pine cones come from. Pine cones are actually, some of the scales actually have the seeds inside. We'll get into that in a minute. And there's actually two flavors of pine cone. There is the pine cone that we all know and love when we look at it, which is the female pine cone, the big ones. Excuse me. So the big ones. And then there are the male pine cones up at the top of the tree, which are these tiny spongy looking dudes. You've probably seen them after they're finished. They'll fall out of the tree, and then you'll be walking along and you'll see like a little stick from up top, and it's covered in these little spongy dudes. And sometimes squirrels eat them, sometimes not. Somebody told me something weird the other semester. They said that pine trees don't have male pine cones anymore, and I'm like, what? So there's some weird misinformation running around again. And no, trust me, if you go out in spring and you look up, if you can look with all the pollen, you will see at the top these teeny weeny looking spongy dudes. These are the male pine cones, and they're just filled with microsporangium, which is what we know as pollen, which is aka tree sperm. So if you're allergic to pollen, congratulations. You're allergic to tree sperm. And the crazy part is, if we go over to the angiosperms, which we will in a minute, they have, for each piece of pollen, 2 sperm inside. Anyway, it's just actually so do these guys. These guys, we'll get to that in a minute. We'll talk about double fertilization, which is kind of a neat thing. So, again, mature pine tree that you've seen out and about, that is a mature sporophyte. So remember, again, the sporophyte generation is the dominant generation. Now, there is a gametophyte. We'll get to that in a minute, which is basically what comes out of the male pine cones and the female pine cones. On the female pine cone side, what we have right here is each one of these. If you've ever pulled a pine cone apart, just for funsies, they have these scales here. And the scales, when a pine cone is not ready to mate yet, all the scales are laid flat. And the single scale actually has, if you go through meiosis, a megaspore on the underside, which has the archegonium. Dun, dun, dun. So this is the female gametophyte. So here's the female gametophyte. And it's underneath there, and when it curls up and is open, that's when it's ready to receive the pollen via wind. So again, same thing over here. So the spongy teeny weeny male pine cones at the top of the tree, because if you think about it, the wind blows and gravity works too. So it makes sense to have your male pine cones that release the pollen at the very tippy top of the tree. So when the wind blows, it catches easily and blows that pollen to the next tree. Say the one's right here, and it goes down and hits the female pine cones, which are around the middle and down of the tree. So about here down is where the female pine cones are. The male pine cones are at the top, female pine cones are out the middle. See what I'm saying? This is why wind works. So the wind hits it, grabs the pollen, and then hits, the next tree over the pine cone, because all their scales are up now, and it flows in and hopefully fertilizes. So again, pollen is the male gametophyte generation. So the male, and again, you have a generative cell and a tube cell. We'll get to that in a minute. And the wings, and it will go over and hopefully hit through wind and jump in and fertilize in the archegonium. And that becomes an embryo, which becomes a seed. We finally have a seed, and some of them get wings. And the pine cone, the female pine cones, it all falls off. And they flutter about and hopefully land and grow into a brand new pine tree, or the mature sporophyte generation. So, yeah. So again, which repeats the cycle, and the mature sporophyte will make male pine cones at the top, which look like these little spongy things, and the female pine cones at the bottom. Again, best time to see these things are in the spring, especially the males. Once they are done dumping all their pollen, they will fall off the plant, and the pine tree doesn't really need them anymore, so it doesn't need to feed them, and he'll grow a new set next spring. And same thing with the pine cones. Once the female pine cones, once they're, they'll get bumped off, and then again, hopefully the seeds scatter and bada bing, or the squirrels eat them all, however it goes. So the gymnosperms, and this is how they use. This is their version of alternation generations. We still have the gametophytes. We just have a male one and a female one now, instead of having male and female on one, or in another case, male and female in another way. And what we see is the mature sporophyte, which makes the male and female parts. So gymnosperms, like I said, these guys are amazingly diverse, and true survivors. These guys have stood up to the test of time on this planet. They've been there before the dinosaurs. They've been after the dinosaurs. And they're still standing there going, yeah, I'm awesome. So, again, give it up. I'd say hug a pine tree, but unfortunately they're also covered in sticky stuff, sap. And if you've ever messed with pine sap, it's no fun to get out of anything. Anyway, now, our friends. So, the next group, and the last group we're going to be talking about, are our friends, the angiosperms. Now, the angiosperms are more recent in the plant line, and we love them. We love them very, very much, and they love us. We're now, because they've decided to use us. So it's kind of a both-way thing, It's kind of cohabitation at this point. So the angiosperms are the flowering plants, and they're the most abundant and diverse on Earth. And that's because they've figured out how to, instead of using wind to pollinate them, they said, hey, look at these weird wiggly creatures all over the place. Look at them insects. Look at these things with legs and stuff. I bet we could use them to pollinate us. And they do. And we're pretty much dependent on them for that. So, like all vascular plants, again, they are dominant by the sporophyte generation. So remember, vascular sporophyte generation is dominant. Non-vascular gametophyte generation is dominant. Keep that in mind. Test question. So anyway, now the flowers, though, they decide to put both their male and female parts into one place and make it really visible, and that's the flower. So these guys have the flower, and if you've ever seen flowers under ultraviolet light, there's a reason for that. flowers basically are runways for insects to go, hey, the pollen is here. The pollen is here. Come on in and get the pollen. It's actually really neat. So they have both the male and female part right here, which is the pistil is the female part and the stamen is the male part. And at the top of the stamen is the anther, which is where all the sperm cells are held. So again, what we have is the pistil, and down inside the pistil is the ovary. Yeah, I can say words. Anyway, and so the female parts waiting for the other side. So again, we've got the gametophyte and the gametophyte separate, but hopefully will come together during pollination. And they have something called double fertilization, which is another test question, which I'm going to get to in a minute. It's got its own slide. So flowers attract animal pollinators. This is where the plant kingdom decided to use the animal kingdom to do its bidding. And because of this, angiosperms can also be quite dependent on the animal kingdom and vice versa. There are some species, and we're going to talk more about this when we talk about ecology a little later, in the fact that these guys, unfortunately, if one dies, so does the other species. They've become so intertwined. Like there are certain flowers that only open for certain hummingbirds in the rainforest. And if those hummingbirds die, that entire plant species will die because only those hummingbirds can pollinate that species. So sometimes they've kind of put themselves into a corner in that way. Now, we're also kind of running into things if we keep hurting the insect groupings that we may not have certain things. Like, for instance, a lot of squash that we eat can only be fertilized by moths. And I'm not kidding about that. And unfortunately, there's, everybody's like, save the bees, which, there is a thing about that. I'm not saying it's wrong. But there's also, we need to be saving the moths. Because a lot of moths actually pollinate our squash. And without them, people with toothbrushes have to go out and hand pollinate all our squash so we can have pumpkin pie. And I'm not kidding on that. So, because the squash flowers only open up in the dusk for moths. And if we get rid of the moths, then no more spaghetti squash, which is actually kind of interesting to eat. Anyway, so again, we have the male and the female put together in a lovely package of a flower. So when you give your loved ones flowers, you are giving them the reproductive parts of a plant. Gee, I wonder if that's why we enjoy giving them to people, for reproductive purposes. Wiggles eyebrows. Anyway. So, yeah. That's going to make Valentine's Day kind of awkward, I guess. Anyway, moving on. Or unless you're like me and I just go, oh, thank you for the reproductive parts of the plant. They're so pretty. Anyway, I'm just weird like that. My husband's used to it, so it's all good. So again, depending on how these guys do, now if the stamen and the anther is actually bigger than the pistil, it can self-pollinate. If the stamen and the anther are actually shorter than the pistil opening at the top, then they can't. They have to have somebody else pollinate them, whether it be insect, flies, people accidentally bumping up on them. There actually are some flowers that actually shoot their pollen with the same force as rockets going up into space. Yeah, I think that species is in Canada. If you walk past them, they just go boo, 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 boo. And then you're covered in their pollen. Yay. Anyway, so again, if it's self-pollinating, usually the stamen and anther is way taller than the pistil, and it can go in and pollinate itself. And some species aren't. So keep in mind. So anyway, what happens is, again, we've got mature ovules inside, and then they have a pollen tube. If the pollen gets in, the pollen will actually grow a little tube down in there to get the sperm, release the two sperm into where the embryo is, and that's actually why we have double fertilization. One gets fertilized and turns into the embryo, which is going to turn into the plant, the sporophyte generation that we know and love. The second fertilization makes the endosperm, which is what the embryo eats. So, yeah, we have double fertilization for one, an embryo, and two, the food. And then the seed coat, again, protects it, so that way it can wait, like, for instance, over the winter without freezing to death. Like, there are certain plants that you have to take their seeds and put them in the fridge for a while before you plant them, or else they won't grow. It's called, cold shocking. And some plants can do that, some plants can't. So if you've got seeds and they're not growing, either they're really, really old and they're just past their expiration date, or throw them in the fridge or throw them in the freezer, like overnight, and pull them back out and then plant them. See if that does it. Because sometimes cold will shock them going, oh, winter's over, time to bloom. So, or time to grow. And that's what we've seen. If you've ever seen, what happens is they split out. You got the little root comes out, the little baby, and then it grows into the sporophyte generation, which, again, then you steal the flowers and you give it to your loved ones and you go, here's the reproductive organs of a plant. I love you. Make it awkward. That's how you find your true love. They'll understand. So again, pollination takes in two forms, as I was going over all these, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is when the anther and the pistil, yeah, so anyway, the anther is way above the pistil, and the pollen can fall in. If it's not, it's down here. Like this picture right here is clearly a cross-pollinator, so it needs another flower to do this. And usually, again, we use a lot of different insect species. Bees are one of them, but we also have a lot of native bees, not just the honeybee. The honeybee is actually an invader from Europe. So European honeybee is what we like to use to make honey, because we've bred them into being docile, happy little buzz. And for the most part, they are. They really don't mind being handled terribly much unless they get upsetty spaghetti. But we have a lot of native bees around here that don't exactly produce giant wads of honey. And that's the thing that we need to be saving is our native bees, not so much the eastern honeybee. The European honeybee. But still, they're all being threatened. And there's certain plants here in North Carolina that cannot be pollinated by the European honeybee, but only our native bees. So that's why it's important. And Blue Ridge's campus is an example of this. They have put out many gardens tailored to native bees, not the honeybee, but native bees, to basically make it a bee-friendly campus. So our campus is, our campus is an official bee-friendly campus. So isn't that sweet? In more ways than one. Anyway, so again, keep in mind, pollination, depending on the method, is just how much energy plants want to make in an investment in trying to provide nectar and pollen for pollinators, because they're trying to sweeten the deal. Usually, again, when a bee or an insect comes in and they get all that pollen, they're going to go turn it into something they can eat. And that's up to the flower. If it's a self-pollinator, it's not going to put out as much pollen because it can pollinate itself. And it doesn't really have anybody to feed. So it's going to make less pollen because it doesn't need that much to pollinate itself, because he's also not trying to entice an insect pollinator to come in and give a share. Now, cross-pollinators, again, the trade-off is here, they get cross-pollinated by insects, but they have to make a ton of pollen to be like, come on and pollinate me, and get all the insects interested to come on over. So nectar or pollen is something the plant has to produce to attract that pollinator in the first place to go from flower to flower and cross-pollinate. So it just depends on how much energy the plant wants to put into reproduction, in the way of, do I want to waste a lot of energy trying to get pollinators to come to me, or do I just not care? And there's again, trade-offs on this, because cross-pollinators are going to be a little bit more hardy, genetically speaking, because what are they doing? They're getting pollen from other plants to come over on the insects and hopefully get pollinated by other, plants, therefore more genetic diversity. And remember what I always say, genetic diversity is the name of the game of surviving in this world. Now, those that don't have to, again, that's why they put all that energy into it, so that way they can get more genetic diversity. Self-pollinators, on the other hand, they don't mind, because technically if they pollinate themselves, they're pollinating themselves with the gametes that they already have. Therefore, it's kind of like making little clones. Again, they don't have to put a lot of energy into it, but unfortunately, if something like a virus comes through or some kind of weird bacteria that their immune system has to fight out, they're all genetically the same, they all have the same weaknesses and may not survive. So again, there's trade-offs and, ups and downs when you have to consider these things if you're a plant, I suppose. Anyway, now, we split the angiosperms again into two overall groups, and that's the monocots and the dicots. And I mentioned this earlier in the last lecture, but let's go ahead and go over it again. So basically, monocots usually have petals in multiples of 3. Their stems are very, very simple. The vascular bundles are very randomly scattered. So keep in mind, very, very simple stems. Their leaves have these straight lines. They're simple shapes. They only have the one cotyledon leaf that pops out. So when you plant a piece of corn and the little shoot comes up, only one leaf will pop off of that. And their roots are usually very, very fibrous. So they're very, very hairy roots. So they don't have a main tap root. So this is not where the carrots come from. Anyway, now they also have bulbs and rhizomes. So again, stems very simple. Vascular tissue is all over the place. Leaves have straight lines on them, parallel veins. Again, when they pop up out of the ground, they only have the one baby leaf. That's a monocot. Now, these guys are important because a lot of these guys we plant for major crops. Corn is a monocot. Wheat is a monocot. I'm sure if you've ever worked on a farm or whatever, you probably know better than I do. So a lot of the guys that we've basically have rows and rows and rows and rows, and usually get a lot of our stuff to make bread and other things and tacos. All of these things. These are usually the monocots. Now, notice there's only about 50,000 species, whereas the dicots, on the other hand, are 200,000 species. There's a bunch of these guys. So, differences. Their seeds, when they pop up, they have 2 seed leaves. So, if you've ever, planted tomatoes and it pops up, this little guy pops up and he has 2 leaves. There you go. The dicot leaves are very simple or compound, but they have reticular veins that have intricate edges. So, it kind of looks like a street view of a city, whereas these guys just looks like one-lane highway. Flowers usually are in groups of 2, 4, 5, so groups of 4s and 5s. The stems are very complex. So if you're looking at a stem of a monocot, it looks like nothing compared to the stem of a dicot. They are really complex. So they have a center core of a woody protrusion, which has the cortex and the bark, which is the pith, and it has the xylem on the phloem around the outside. The roots have usually a very woody taproot, some of which we can eat, some of which I wouldn't suggest if you like your teeth. So they have a very thick taproot and little root hairs popping off of that. That also means they can stand a lot more and take a lot more punishment. And sometimes we can eat it like carrots or turnips. So again, a lot of our fruits and vegetables come out of the dicots. So, tomatoes. Heck, apple trees. Welcome to Henderson County. Apple trees, apple trees, apple trees. They're dicots. Anyway, now, why do the plant kingdom pretty much run the planet? Well, these guys have insane ways of basically, they figured out, hey, how do we survive? Well, let's protect our seed with nutrients and a protective coat so it doesn't dry out. It can be transported via wind or stuck to animals if you've ever been hit by burrs and gotten things, burrs stuck all over you, congratulations, you've just been hit up by a seed. Or even apple seeds. Some of them want you to eat their fruit, like apples, because the seeds actually go through our digestive system relatively unharmed. And then the seed goes out our digestive system and automatically is pooped out with fertilizer. A win-win. We get fruit and they get fertilizer out the other after having a fabulous journey through our gut. I guess. I mean, they're plants. Anyway, so again, plants are using us, but at the same time, I can't blame them. Anyway, so seeds can disperse over long distances by wind and other means. Some of them float, some of them, then there's the ones like out west, because technically out west should be on fire every season. We don't like it because it destroys all our buildings, and it's not fun, at all. But a lot of those pine trees, their seeds only get cracked open and are ready to sprout after they've been ravaged by a fire. So they're literally built for fire. They're like, yeah, fire, fire. So, in addition, all seeds, all plants have reduced gamma pollen. These adaptations help plants cope with drought and exposure to ultraviolet radiation. And for the seed plants, they don't need water. Unlike the non-vasculars and the seedless vasculars that need water for any of that to occur, these guys don't need it anymore, which is why they dominated the land before insects even came out and started taking over. Which is why the angiosperms went, hello, when the insects, is the next wave of critters to basically take over the land after the plant kingdom was the insects. Insects popped out and said, oh, look at all this oxygen. We can grow huge. So, like I said, with basically the invention of the seed, plants took over the land. And then plants terraformed the planet. And unfortunately, though, plants terraformed the planet so well that they actually snowballed the planet a couple of times because they did so much photosynthesis on top of what the green algae was already doing. Keep in mind, green algae play a major, huge role in a lot of our photosynthesis. The plant kingdom likes to take all the credit because they're right there. But FYI, Protista makes most of our oxygen. But between Protista, the green algae, and the plant kingdom pumping out a ton of oxygen and nobody really using it, they kind of accidentally changed the climate so bad that they snowballed the whole earth a couple of times. It wasn't until the animal kingdom came up and started using up all that oxygen and finally making this oxygen-carbon dioxide balance that we now have, called the carbon cycle, that we finally don't snowball the earth every 5 seconds. So, or 5 million years. Anyway, give or take. So, yeah, plants almost killed us off a couple of times. And it actually did kind of kill off land animals a couple of times, too, because they did that and went, oops, and all the land animals died off, and the ones down the ocean were like, oh, great, now we have to figure this all out again. And the plants were like, sorry, my bad. We'll get into that later. Anyway, double fertilization. So, why fertilize once when you can do it twice and make food? So, gymnosperms are known as the naked seeds. So pine cones, whatnot, they're known as naked seeds. Because basically these guys, while they do have a seed coat that's derived from the pine cone itself, a lot of these guys, they only get fertilized once. So this fertilization happens. This basically, the megasporangium is right there. The megaspore is in the middle. This is an unfertilized ovule right here. Basically, the pollen finally gets in. He attaches, the sperm is discharged into the egg nucleus, which comes down to meet it. And inside is the embryo, and the food supply is from the female gametophyte tissue. So you'll notice the food supply comes from the female gametophyte tissue. It is not something that is created along with the embryo. So we only have one fertilization. That's why it's called the naked seed, compared to the insanity the angiosperms decided to come up with. Because they were like, yeah, I bet we could do it twice and do it cooler than you. And again, the gymnosperms are like, dude, we're the most successful group. What is your problem? And they're like, anything you can do, we can do better. Anyway, so what happens here, again, is the sperm actually has, interestingly enough, a pollen tube nucleus and 2 sperm inside. So a mature pollen grain of an angiosperm has 2 sperm and this pollen tube. So what happens is he falls in, but none of these things are going to the female ovum inside the pistil. So what they do is they grow this tube. This tube gets grown out of this pollen and goes wee and finds an ovule and grows right into it. So they have to build their own road to get the sperm where it needs to go. Gymnosperms don't even, they're like, what, why? And that's why they're the naked seed. These guys, I mean, we have to drive our own, build our own road and invade. So it goes into the female egg and the 2 sperm. One of them will, it also has a couple other things hanging out here, which is known as a triploid cell. So basically, one of them finds the actual egg and fertilizes it. The other one goes up and meets these other 2 dudes hanging out here, these haploid nuclei, and creates what's known, so we got a diploid zygote, so we got the female and the male finally fertilized, and we get a triploid cell right here. That triploid cell turns into the endosperm, which is the food that the embryo inside the seed is going to eat. And we like eating it too. That's why we like eating sunflower seeds and other things. Now remember, peanuts are not this. They're a legume, different potato. Actually, different nut. Anyway, so the endosperm that the embryo eats is actually triploid because that second sperm goes up and meets these 2 and hangs out together and turns into the triploid cell. And then the embryo is what will crack out eventually of the seed coat. So the difference is, again, gymnosperm, basically the female gametophyte tissue becomes the food for the embryo. Whereas in the angiosperm, they go through double fertilization. And because of this, one of the sperm will create the endosperm, which is triploid, and the embryo, which will become the plant that will eventually crack out of the seed and grow up into your tomato plant or whatever your plant is going to be right there. Ta-da! So, angiosperms do it with double fertilization, gymnosperms don't. Because gymnosperms, the female gametophyte becomes the embryo's food. And in this case, this kind of makes it, in the angiosperms, they make their own food. Weird, but fun. So, just FYI, double fertilization is going to be a test question. All right, there's a lot of videos here. Highly recommend watching. We got vascular plants.
This is Yar.
Yeah. We got plant reproduction. He goes over that.
A couple of weeks ago.
I have some more. Plant land characteristics. Again, alternation of generations is going to be a huge thing here. No, we're not doing that. Again, he goes over the different parenchyma, parenchyma, and sclerenchyma if you want to get back deeper into that. I'm not going to beat you up on that so much. Plant nutrition and transport. So again, how the vascular system, xylem and phloem work. And they think that's it. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to leave you with my last thing I want to talk about the plant kingdom. And that is this. And that is the dumbest plant in the world. And that, my friends, is... Hold on. And now it just left. Now I am the dumbest plant in the world. Oh, the Bradford pear. So, let me tell you the story of the Bradford pear. Bradford pear, if you've never seen a Bradford pear, they're all over the place. People used to love planting them, especially in the 1950s, because they grow fast. And they smell like... bleh. They also are usually one of the first things that flower around here. And if you see Bradford pear, I suggest destroying it with fire. And there was a reason I said this. So once upon a time, there was a botanist, and he wanted to make a fast-growing tree that was very, very pretty. And he wanted to sell this off, make some money. And he really liked pear trees. And he was up in Washington State, or Oregon, I think. Anyway, Northwest. What? are they doing? Sorry, my cats are distracting me. I'll steal them for the next lecture. So anyway, long story short, what happened was these guys. So these guys basically he wanted to make a different. He wanted to make something fast growing. He didn't want it to fruit. He wanted a fruitless pear tree. And so he wanted an ornament. He wanted to make an ornamental pear tree. Okay, fair. But every time he tried breeding different breeds of pear trees, he kept getting fruit because he really didn't want the fruit droppings. Nobody really wanted the fruit droppings, either even if it's a, one that you can eat. I've had regular pear trees, not this type, and I assure you, if you don't get to the fruit fast enough, the bees and the wasps will, and yeah, and then your tree turns into a, sting heaven. So he was trying to figure out how to make an ornamental tree out of pears. Finally, he discovered he really liked this one pear tree that's actually native to the Canada, but he actually discovered that there was another pear tree in the family that didn't really have fruits, and it was from China. And this is where the story gets weird. So he goes, "Oh, cool." But he did have access to some of these pear trees. They're more like bushes with thorns, but it was a pear tree. And we'll get into that in a minute. So what happened was he was like, cool, I can breed, fruitless pear trees for ornamental purposes. Cool. But I need pure Chinese pear trees. I don't need these because they've been in North America too long. I don't think they're pure, a pure breed of plant. So I need somebody to go to China and get me some of those pear trees and bring them back so I can make a perfect hybrid. So he sent his buddy. So he had a buddy who was familiar with China at the time. I think this was in the 1920s, 1930s. Anyway, so he sent his buddy and he said, I need you to go find these Chinese pear trees. They don't look like a tree. They look like a bush with thorns. Go. And his buddy's like, eh. So his buddy goes to China on a boat and then goes up, I think the Yellow River, on another boat. And finally, at the tippy top, he finds them in this mountainous region. And these trees don't look like trees. They look like scrub bush. They're crinkly and weird, and they have thorns that are like freaking huge. They're a hardy, even though they're in the pear tree family, they're hardy. They're really hard to kill. So he found them and he was like, oh, cool, sweet. So he harvests some, packs them on his boat, gets on his boat. Now keep in mind, he's got guides and everything, and it's not just him on this boat. There's a whole bunch of people. And he gets on the boat and he packages up all the tree samples and he plasters, send it, back to his friend. So he's on the boat. The tree samples are all packed up on the boat. They start going back down the Yellow River. And one night, he disappears. Yeah, he's just gone. The captain of the boat, all the hands on the boat, they couldn't find him. They couldn't find him anywhere. They think he jumped off the boat. We don't know. This is the mystery of the Bradford pair. Where did the dude's buddy go? Nobody knows. He's gone. One day he was on the boat. The next morning he was gone. Did he, unalive himself? Did he? We don't know. It's an enduring mystery to this day. So this is where I think the Bradford pair is cursed.
This place is cursed.
It's cursed.
This is cursed. That is cursed. Give it a rest, will ya?
So, what happened is, though, the Chinese pear tree samples got back to the original botanist. And they told him, dude, your friend disappeared. And he was like, oh, that's weird. And then moved on with his project. So he bred a Canadian pear tree with the Chinese pear tree and got the Bradford pear tree. And that's where the Bradford pear tree came from. So again, cursed story. Already killed somebody somehow. Pear trees are evil. Anyway, so long story short, Not really, actually. What happens is the what happens is the Bradford pear becomes the new darling of the 1950s, because what happened in the 1950s? We just got out of World War II. Suddenly we're building suburbs. The Bradford pear grows fast, looks pretty, and those two things make it really appealing for developers when they're building all these huge suburbs. And that's when the 1950s, when the suburbs appeared. So we bulldozed all this land, turned it into suburbs, and we need trees. So Bradford pear, Bradford pear, Bradford pear, Bradford pear. And it was the same thing here in North Carolina. About 20 years past, anytime they put in a new highway, in the middle part, they'd plant Bradford pears. You could see some of them used to be down near Raleigh, Durham. And now we've ripped them all out because they do horrible things. They are so stupid because they grow so fast that usually a regular tree, when it grows, the trunk will be, thick enough to hold up the top of the tree, all the branches and junk. If the trunk doesn't grow at the same rate the branches do, or the canopy, basically the tree will split itself in half and die. And that's what the Bradford pear does all the time in the South. We don't see the other half of it, which the Midwest got the brunt of. So what happens is Bradford pears, they grow real fast, but they grow so fast that the top of the tree outweighs and just outstripes the growth of the trunk. The trunk can't support it, and it splits into half and kills itself. So not only is it stinky and stupid, it kills itself. Yay, Bradford pear. So that's bad enough as is. However, in the Midwest, something about the Midwest environment triggers the Bradford pear to revert to its more Chinese ancestry. And there, it actually is almost impossible to kill. It will take over. It's like kudzu here, except worse. And it just takes over entire parking lots, and it has huge thorns. And you have to go in and no, just cutting it doesn't kill it, because like I said, it reverts to its Chinese ancestry, and the fact that those plants are out, on a half a Chinese mountain in the middle of barely any rain, they can live through anything and have giant freaking thorns. So it turns into just, brambles of insanity out in the Midwest. So the Bradford pear is the dumbest tree, and we made it, and it killed a guy or something, or made it disappear. Maybe it knew. But anyway, so the Bradford pear is our public enemy number one. Humans made it. Don't plant them. And if you find one, my suggestion is to prune it off right at ground level with a chainsaw. Just go, and then maybe set the trunk on fire or something. I don't know. But yeah, Bradford pear, the world's dumbest plant. There you go. Next time, we're going to talk about the animal kingdom. And again, they had to overcome the water problem just like the animal kingdom did, except we did it in a little different ways with the clever use of eggs. But we'll get to that in the next lecture, and I'll see you then. Bye!